We begin in the relentless motion of a world that simply will not slow down. Everything moves with an urgent, unstoppable force, a river running to the sea, or perhaps the inexorable turning of a wheel. And we find ourselves caught within its current. It is here, at this very precipice, where life's challenges appear most overwhelming, most insurmountable. We encounter loss as if it were a sudden, brutal physical blow or disappointment that feels like a deep, irreversible plunge into cold water. The first instinct of the human heart, when confronted by genuine chaos, is to panic, to resist. It is a wild, desperate flailing against forces far greater than ourselves. The economic shift, the broken trust, the health crisis that strikes without warning. Our emotions are powerful currents themselves, flooding our perception until the sheer magnitude of the storm drowns out any rational thought. We cling desperately to the certainty of yesterday, fearing the uncertainty of tomorrow with a primal intensity. And in this state of acute distress, we become masters of our worst habits. Anger flares like sudden lightning when something is denied or taken away. Anxiety whispers doubts into the quiet moments, keeping us sleepless and trapped within cycles of painful overthinking. We revisit arguments endlessly in the dark hours before sleep, rehearsing grievances that cannot change the past, only deepening the wound within the spirit. We build defenses against reality. If we can just keep fighting, if we just maintain this level of frantic effort, perhaps the pressure will lift. Our struggle is valiant, a pure testament to our deep desire for equilibrium. Yet it is also exhausting. It drains us utterly, leaving us hollowed out and incapable of viewing the situation with any measure of clarity. The world does not pause simply because we are suffering. The bills still arrive, the required decisions must be made, relationships must continue their difficult dance toward resolution. We realize, often through grueling exhaustion, that our inner struggle, while intense, is ultimately failing to alter the external reality. All our screaming and flailing generates noise, but it creates no shield against the coming storm. The soul finds itself at a critical juncture, standing on the edge of this tumultuous sea. The initial, uncontrolled surge of panic must somehow abate. There needs to be a physical stopping point, a moment where the sheer weight of existence forces an abrupt and unexpected stillness. It is in these forced lulls that the deepest philosophical questioning often germinates. The chaos demands pause. The torrent of emotion requires silence. We are left, suddenly, alone with the vast expanse of our own mind, staring perhaps at a simple object, a worn stone, a single leaf blown across concrete, and we feel profoundly small. In that moment, amidst the swirling debris of crisis and despair, the questions become unavoidable. How long can I continue like this? Is this frantic struggle truly making me stronger? What am I actually fighting for? These questions are not merely intellectual curiosities. They are existential demands. They challenge the foundations upon which we have built our understanding of self-worth and safety. We question the automatic nature of our anger, the unquestioning acceptance of external blame, and the deep comfort we derived from routine certainty. The sheer pressure of survival forces a kind of mental reckoning. The world around you demands an answer. It screams for a reaction, a flare of anger, a hasty withdrawal, or perhaps the exhaustion that simply leaves you paralyzed. These are the default settings of the human mind, primal, immediate, and often self-destructive. For so long, we have lived believing that feeling must be followed by action, that resistance is synonymous with fighting back. We treat our emotional state as a physical barrier against the world, constructing mental fortifications designed to keep external threats out. Yet, in reality, this constant struggle depletes us. It leaves us operating on fumes of adrenaline and regret. To survive the initial shock of crisis, we often default to the loudest, most volatile response. Consider that sudden flash of blinding rage when something unfair happens, or the exhausting cycle of overthinking, dissecting every past interaction, replaying conversations until they lose all meaning. These are not signs of strength. They are evidence of internal conflict. They show us that we are fighting battles against reality itself, battles fought within the fragile confines of our own minds. We expend tremendous energy trying to force events to be different than they are, struggling desperately to control other people's choices, the passage of time, or outcomes entirely outside our reach. This resistance is perhaps the heaviest burden we carry. It brings us to this pivotal point, the sheer struggle for breath. Our natural inclination is not towards stillness. It is towards mobilization, a frantic scrambling to regain a perceived sense of mastery. We cling tightly to certainty, assuming that if only we could predict, plan, or simply push hard enough against the current, then peace would return. But the world does not yield its secrets to brute force. The storm continues, regardless of how loud our protests become. The most exhausting realization is this: panic and resistance are two sides of the same coin. Both stem from a fundamental misalignment between what we desire and the reality presented to us. We resist the uncomfortable feeling because it feels like pain, yet resisting it only deepens the wound. The constant loop of worry, the spiraling thoughts that tell us everything is worst-case scenario, is merely resistance given linguistic form. It demands action against a threat that might not exist at all. To truly begin the journey toward tranquility, we must learn to identify this inner roar. We must recognize when our thoughts are not observations of reality, but rather aggressive maneuvers designed to fight what simply is. This requires immense mental effort, a turning inward that feels utterly unnatural at first. It means accepting the initial wave of raw, unchanneled emotion without immediately reacting to it. You have been trained your whole life to act. Now, you must learn to pause instead. The immediate crisis does not stop because we decide it should. The difficult situation persists, but by noticing the sheer volume of energy spent fighting the inevitable, something profound begins to shift. It becomes clear that much of our suffering is generated internally. It is the judgment applied to external events that fuels the fire, not the event itself. Our panicked efforts are often directed at changing other people's hearts or fixing systemic flaws, tasks for which we have no jurisdiction. They are attempts to hijack destiny with sheer will. The recognition of this internal battleground must be painful. It requires looking at your own mind and seeing it as a site of constant, noisy argument. You find yourself arguing with your memories, arguing with others' opinions, and most fiercely, arguing with the natural disorder of life itself. The rawest lesson here is that true power does not come from fighting harder against the current, but from recognizing when and where the fight must momentarily cease. This period of emotional chaos is not a sign of weakness. It is simply the necessary prelude to wisdom. It is the turbulent water before the calm lake. By naming this internal struggle, by labeling the roar as merely resistance, we begin the arduous, quiet process of disarmament. We start learning that peace does not arrive from changing external circumstances, but from mastering the boundaries of our own attention and judgment within the chaos. The world around them had reached a fever pitch. It was noise and adrenaline, the dizzying rush of trying to fix everything, all at once. For weeks, the struggle had been a constant roar, an unceasing battle against the tides of chaos. Every external setback felt like a personal failing, Every perceived slight seemed proof of deeper inadequacy. The old coping mechanisms were exhausted, the quick burst of anger, the desperate attempts to control other people's outcomes, the exhausting spiral into overthinking. They stood at the absolute limit of their stamina. There was nowhere left to run, no immediate problem solved by a frantic gesture. What remained was only the wreckage of effort and the terrifying realization that sheer force would not build a better life. The body slowed down, reluctantly accepting the profound lack of energy. And in that sudden slowdown came something far more alarming than exhaustion: silence. This stillness brought doubt. A deep, unsettling quiet settled into the core of their understanding. They found themselves staring at nothing in particular: a chipped stone on the pavement, a cloud moving too slowly across the sky. It was a moment where the urgent tasks and the emotional drama simply ceased to matter. The frantic narratives they had been running 24 hours a day finally stalled. They were forced into a contemplation of the pause itself. The mind, suddenly deprived of goals and panic, began to ask questions it could not answer with action or emotion. What was wrong? Was the problem out there, in the messiness of their lives, or had they simply become so accustomed to fighting that they forgot how to just observe? This moment of doubt felt less like a crisis and more like an unexpected suspension of reality, a mandatory pause button pressed by existence itself. They started noticing the patterns. They realized that their distress was not always proportional to the event. A minor critique from a colleague could trigger a disproportionate emotional storm, leading to days of brooding regret. Meanwhile, they could witness genuine tragedy unfold nearby and feel only a dull, detached sense of observation, rather than the overwhelming panic they were used to. This discrepancy became the seed of doubt, the quiet suspicion that their suffering was generated not by external acts, but by internal interpretations. The sheer act of questioning felt both terrifyingly vulnerable and profoundly liberating. They began to peel back the layers of instant judgment, judging an event as unfair immediately created suffering, judging a person's actions as cruel triggered immediate self-recrimination. Each label they applied, whether positive or negative, was shown to be nothing more than a momentary consensus that could be instantly revoked. This contemplative vacuum forced them toward the deepest philosophical water: the question of control. If emotional turmoil resulted from judgment, and not from the events themselves, then perhaps the most powerful place to exert energy was not on changing the world, but on changing the internal dialogue. This shift demanded radical honesty, the willingness to sit with discomfort until the frantic need for an answer simply burned out. The pause became a classroom of extreme patience. They learned that resisting the feeling of doubt only amplified it. To embrace the unsureness was to meet it head-on, acknowledging, "I do not know what is right. I do not know how to fix this. I am suspended here in an unanswerable moment." The mind, gradually disarmed by its own questioning, started whispering truths that were both unsettling and profoundly sturdy. The narrative shifted from "I must overcome this" to "what is happening." Precisely. They began meticulously separating the raw data of reality, the traffic jam, the canceled plan, the unexpected bill, from the emotional interpretation layered upon it. This means I am failing. This signifies abandonment. These thoughts were shown not as facts, but merely stories that had captured their attention. And learning to let go of the story was becoming a physical act of self-preservation, an arduous journey back toward a fragile, hard-won stillness. We stand at a critical junction. After the exhausting torrent of emotion that marked our early struggle, we have reached a profound moment of stillness. The internal roar has quieted to a hum, a restless questioning. We are no longer simply reacting to life's pressures. We are finally observing them. And in this observation, a deeper, more fundamental truth emerges: the relentless human need to control everything around us. We fight the tide, we battle the wind, we try to predict every outcome, assuming that if we just manage enough inputs, if we just plan perfectly, then peace will follow. But history whispers another warning. The greatest expenditure of energy often goes not into fixing the outside world, but into fighting against our own mistaken assumptions about it. This brings us to the starkest lesson of all: recognizing the boundary between what belongs to us and what remains perpetually beyond our grasp. Consider everything you have ever cherished, every great achievement, every relationship that brought you comfort or joy. Were these things ultimately solid? Did they withstand the passage of time, the inevitable shift of fortune, the unpredictable hand of another person? Very few external blessings, no matter how brilliant they seemed in their moment of arrival, possess an inherent guarantee of permanence. They are all borrowed, contingent, and fleeting. The Stoic meditation forces us to perform a profound philosophical triage. We must draw a line. On one side lie the events themselves, the sudden market downturn, the words spoken by a loved one, the physical failing of the body, or the actions of an unpredictable crowd. These are raw input from life's stream. They simply happen. On the other side, we find our own inner space, our judgments, our intentions, and the manner in which we choose to respond. The first step toward freedom is radical acceptance of this division. It requires acknowledging that much of what causes us distress does not arrive with a catastrophic bang, but rather with the subtle weight of assumption, the belief that things ought to be different than they are. We spend so much effort constructing elaborate mental architectures based on ideal outcomes. I must get this job. She should understand me. The economy ought to improve by next quarter. And when reality inevitably deviates from these self-imposed blueprints, we collapse into disappointment and then despair. The philosophical discipline, therefore, is one of continuous divestment. What do you truly own? Is it your reputation? No, that belongs only to others' perceptions. Is it your possessions? Not entirely. They are temporary custodianship. Your health, its maintenance is a constant negotiation with biology and fortune. The few things we retain, the elements that remain inviolable through every storm, are those within our own mind. Our capacity to judge, our will to deliberate before reacting, our fundamental intention to live justly. This understanding should feel unsettling, perhaps even frightening. To realize how much of your daily anxiety is predicated upon controlling variables, the weather, other people's moods, the decisions of committees, is a monumental act of psychological stripping away. It forces us to shrink our concerns back down until they fit within that small, unshakable core. This shrinking process is not nihilistic. It is liberating. It redirects all the colossal energy we used for fighting impermanence and channels it into something meaningful, becoming masters of the immediate self. The world continues its chaotic spin whether we intend it to or not. The traffic jam remains, regardless of our frustration level. The critique still arrives, irrespective of how much we wish otherwise. But if we can train ourselves to meet these unchangeable facts, these indifferent occurrences, with steady equanimity, something remarkable happens. We do not merely survive the challenges, we begin to utilize them as highly valuable training grounds. Consider life itself as an enormous gymnasium for the soul. Every inconvenience, every setback, every unexpected failure is nothing more than a weighted barbell designed specifically for us. The goal is never to avoid discomfort, for that is impossible in human existence, but rather to practice enduring it. to meet the friction of reality not with panicked resistance, but with measured observation. This shift is embodied by viewing events as neutral data points. A criticism is simply a statement, devoid of inherent moral weight until we ourselves inject judgment into it. Bad weather is just atmospheric pressure. A broken object is merely material science meeting gravity. They are facts. Our tendency, however, is to immediately wrap these bare facts in layers of narrative. Bad weather means a ruined holiday. The criticism proves my inadequacy. The Stoic sage learns to peel away those layers of interpretation until only the pure event remains, a manageable piece of information that can be processed rationally. This detachment does not signal indifference or apathy. It is an intense, focused form of engagement with reality itself, allowing us to respond thoughtfully rather than merely reacting emotionally. The journey of mastery, therefore, is accepting this beautiful asymmetry, recognizing the vast, wild expanse of external life, its beauty, its cruelty, its sheer unpredictability, and simultaneously finding profound and absolute rest within the small circumference of self-control. It is realizing that while you can never truly own a day, or another person's heart, or even your own current physical state, you possess the single most precious commodity, the unfettered sovereignty over how you interpret it all. That internal citadel remains unconquered, and with its resilience, we find our lasting peace. We spent so long fighting the waves of what we could not command. We treated life as a battlefield where every external blow demanded a furious, immediate retaliation. We were always looking out, desperate to control the outcomes, to force reality into behaving according to our deepest wishes and most urgent expectations. This frantic vigilance was utterly exhausting. It drained us of the very energy needed for inner peace. The great wisdom that dawned slowly suggested a fundamental shift in perspective, the distinction between what belongs within ourselves and what lies beyond our reach. We realized that much of our suffering stemmed from spending all our vital mental resources on the external sphere, on the weather, on other people's opinions, on unpredictable global events. Our focus needed to shrink. Our energy, once cast across a vast, chaotic plane of concern, had to be drawn back inward, condensed into a small, manageable space. This was the first great visual lesson in Stoic discipline, the circle of influence. It is a powerful and necessary graphic tool for self-mastery. The philosophy asks us now to map our concerns onto two distinct concentric circles. The outer ring represents the circle of concern. Within this vast expanse, we find everything that tends to provoke panic. What others think of us, the global economy, past mistakes, sudden misfortunes, and even the mere fact that life itself is unpredictable. The circle of concern is immense, overwhelming, and inherently powerless in terms of direct action. To live entirely within its boundaries is to condemn oneself to perpetual anxiety. It offers no reliable source of tranquility because it includes everything, and thus, nothing solid. But the deeper we focus, the clearer the pattern becomes. Nested inside this massive perimeter lies a far smaller ring, the circle of control. This small space requires all our careful attention, because within it resides everything that is genuinely ours to cultivate, refine, and decide. It contains our judgments, our intentions, our immediate responses, and the virtues we choose to practice in any given moment. The journey required by this understanding is one of profound mental subtraction. We must learn not simply what we control, but more importantly, where we are currently misplacing our effort. Every time a sudden external difficulty strikes, a critique from a superior, a broken plan, a relationship conflict, our immediate instinct is to flare up and defend the outer boundary. We try to pull that event into the circle of concern, treating it as if controlling it were possible. The practice is simple in concept, but radical in its daily execution. When faced with stress, draw this diagram mentally. Ask yourself immediately, is this a matter of pure judgment, or is this something external that requires my physical effort to change? If the answer points outward, if we are grappling with other people's inevitable actions or uncontrollable chance, our training must be acceptance. We practice watching those elements pass through the outer circle of concern without letting them disrupt the quiet equilibrium of the inner circle. The true freedom arrives at that point where a challenge arises, a harsh word, an unexpected loss, a moment of injustice, and we do not react immediately from panic. Instead, we pause and mentally constrain our view to the core self. We ask, what judgment am I making about this event? My choice is simply to choose how I interpret it. This interpretation becomes the sole domain of my will. This shrinking focus is more than just intellectual mapping. It is an emotional act of radical acceptance. It demands that we accept impermanence not as a theory, but as a practical boundary condition for our actions. We are gently taught to realize that while we cannot choose what happens to us, we always retain the fundamental power over how deeply we allow it to trouble us. By dedicating ourselves solely to improving the small space within, our discipline, our reaction speed, our capacity for rational judgment, we find that this narrow circumference becomes incredibly robust. It becomes a powerful anchor against the overwhelming tides of external chaos. This realization is the heart of Stoic serenity, strength found not in conquering the world around us, but in mastering the fortress built entirely within the self. Throughout this journey of self-discovery, we have been taught to look away from the uncontrollable storms raging outside. We learned that the true battlefield is not in the world around us, but within the architecture of our own minds. If external events are merely data, neutral facts occurring nonetheless, then where does our pain truly originate? It comes from the story we tell ourselves about those facts. It arrives when we mistake a circumstance for an injustice, or simply a mere challenge for a catastrophic threat. This is the crucial juncture, recognizing that your emotional distress is not caused by reality itself, but by your subjective judgment of it. Imagine that you are faced with a profound setback, a loss of status, a sudden disappointment, perhaps even a physical injury. Our immediate human instinct is to run, to resist, and to argue against what is happening. We grasp for control over the past or desperate attempts to force change in the future. But the Stoic philosophy asks us to pause. It demands that we interrogate our initial reaction with cool logic. Are we reacting merely because we are afraid, or because we have genuinely assessed the situation? The difference is monumental. Fear and reality often wear similar disguises. They both present themselves as inevitable crises demanding immediate, panicked attention. But panic operates from a place of assumption. It assumes the worst outcome will happen, and that this worst case is somehow intolerable to existence itself. Reality, however, simply presents what is. It might be loud. It might be painful. It might feel entirely unfair. Yet, stripped bare of our emotional interpretation, reality lacks teeth. It just is. To navigate this space requires a disciplined act of reframing. We must train ourselves to become objective witnesses to the drama of life. When the crisis hits, do not immediately accept the narrative that fuels your anguish. Instead, pause and ask yourself 3 vital questions. First, is what I am feeling fact or mere interpretation? Second, could this situation, even if difficult, be a neutral event requiring only adaptation? And finally, what actionable response, however small, is truly within my immediate sphere of influence? This process is fundamentally one of cognitive dismantling. We are not required to suddenly feel joyous acceptance. We are asked for something far more challenging: impartiality. When faced with adversity, the mind naturally biases toward survival mode, and that bias favors emotional escalation. The Stoic mind seeks instead a calculated detachment, the recognition that while the blow itself is undeniable, the severity of the resulting wound is determined solely by our mental refusal to accept its neutrality. Consider this approach to negative visualization, but from a stance of questioning rather than simple rehearsal. Instead of merely saying what might be lost, we treat the potential loss as an object of pure philosophical debate. If I lose my job, for example, does that truly mean the end of my capacity to build a meaningful life? Or does it simply remove one material support structure, thereby creating space for others? The goal here is not to become nihilistic or indifferent. It is profoundly different. It is about seeing things as temporary data points, valuable only because they allow us to practice resilience. A failed venture, a strained relationship, the unexpected rejection, these are not indictments of our worth. They are simply input into the grand system of existence, requiring nothing more than reasoned acknowledgement and thoughtful pivot. We must learn that pain is not an absolute measure of suffering. Suffering requires the addition of judgment. This hurt me. Therefore, my life cannot continue under this weight. By practicing separation, by acknowledging that the external event is merely friction, and our reaction is a conscious choice, that is where freedom resides. The crisis presents itself as a monster demanding all your energy, screaming in demands for emotional compliance. But we are taught to treat it like an experiment. We gather data. What were the variables? What did I assume was certain that turned out to be fluid? By treating hardship not as punishment, but as intense, mandatory training, a difficult, personalized curriculum designed by life itself, we begin to alter our understanding of failure. Failure ceases to be a marker of inadequacy and becomes simply feedback, indicating where our skills need refinement. The ultimate reframing is one of power, the recognition that you possess the final veto over your own emotional landscape. The event may shake the foundations of your perceived world, but it cannot penetrate the fortress built by disciplined reason. Your peace is not contingent upon a favorable outcome or the cessation of external turmoil. It resides only in the unwavering commitment to judging every moment, every challenge, and every apparent crisis, with the calm, impartial gaze of one who has seen life's cyclical nature before. This internal sovereignty is the true reward, the ultimate mastery that outlasts any storm. We have learned to distinguish between what is truly ours and what belongs only to the sweep of fortune. We know that external events, whether a loss, an injury, or a sudden shift in circumstance, are fundamentally indifferent. They simply happen. But the pain, the deep, consuming anguish, rarely stems from the blow itself. It springs instead from our immediate judgment of that blow, our belief that this setback defines us, or that we deserved better. Having focused on recognizing the uncontrollable, and thus shriveling our mental focus to the small domain of our own intentions, a new level of training is required. We must prepare ourselves not merely for adversity, but for its deepest forms. This practice, known as negative visualization, is an act of intellectual courage. It feels counterintuitive at first, to actively imagine suffering, loss, or failure in the safety of your mind. Yet, this imaginative rehearsal is one of the most powerful tools we possess to disarm us emotionally. By confronting the specter of pain before it arrives fully formed in reality, we strip it of its shock value and therefore much of its power over our inner peace. Consider that cherished possession, the thing you rely upon for comfort or identity. Visualize it broken, lost entirely, discarded. See the cold reality of its absence. Do not flinch from this vision. Meet it with clear, steady observation. This is not pessimism. It is mental inoculation. We are deliberately practicing the emotional distance required to absorb future blows without crumbling into panic. Then imagine the person you trust most, whose presence you take for granted, suddenly withdrawing their affection or leaving your life entirely. Allow the thought of that quiet void to settle around you. Observe your initial reaction, the tightness in the chest, the rush of anger, the sense of deep betrayal. But as an observer, a detached philosopher examining his own mind, you must hold steady. You are watching a simulated emergency from the relative safety of introspection. The goal here is to train the muscle of acceptance before the weight of circumstance forces you to use it in genuine extremity. By rehearsing grief, we diminish the capacity for shock. When the true loss happens, when the cherished item truly breaks, or when the relationship finally ends with irreversible finality, the emotional impact will not be a monumental tidal wave, but a manageable swell. Your mind has already walked through these waters many times in simulation. This process requires radical intellectual honesty. We must resist the natural human urge to build protective fantasies, to construct mental barriers that promise invulnerability. Those fantasies are temporary comforts, but they become brittle when tested by reality. Instead, we confront the reality head-on, that all things are fleeting and clinging too tightly only guarantees pain when separation occurs. We practice visualizing not just loss, but also our own limitations, our frailty and illness, the decline of strength, the eventual inability to perform tasks we now take for granted. By contemplating these natural ends, we do two profound things. First, we strip away the false sense of permanence that is a primary source of human anxiety. Nothing stays fixed. Second, and most importantly, we cultivate a radical detachment from outcome. We learn that while it feels devastating to lose something, our inherent capacity for reason and self-respect remains untouched by its passing. This inner core, this citadel of judgment, is the one possession no external force can touch. The key is maintaining perspective during these visualizations. When the wave of despair comes with the imagined loss, do not merely sit in it. Ask yourself, what truth does this scenario reveal? If I lose everything material, what remains that is truly mine? It is my ability to reason, my capacity for moral choice, and the virtuous character I have built through consistent effort. These elements are non-negotiable. They cannot be stolen or broken. By making these uncomfortable mental connections, the loss of wealth, the fading of health, the severing of ties, we do not succumb to despair. We achieve a profound state of preparedness. We trade naive attachment for robust resilience. We move from fearing pain as an unpredictable ambush to recognizing it as a predictable cycle of experience. This mastery over imagination becomes the ultimate guard against the capriciousness of fate. It grounds us in the absolute certainty that even when everything external falls away, our inner capacity remains resolute and untouched. This steady practice, this deliberate confronting of human vulnerability, is how we truly build an unshakable calm. A quiet knowing that regardless of what life throws at us, we possess the internal resources to meet it with reason, dignity, and enduring strength. We have traveled far from the frantic edge of crisis. We learned to pause the internal roar and identify what was truly ours to own. The judgments, the intentions, the conscious choice in the moment's tide. The mind had begun to understand the law of personal sovereignty, that while we cannot command external events, we can master our response to them. But true philosophy is not merely a theory learned under quiet lights. It is muscle memory forged in discomfort. It demands movement, effort, and often the deliberate choice to feel poorly for the sake of growth. We cannot expect emotional strength simply because we have read about it or contemplated its principles. Acceptance itself must be practiced. Consider now those moments where life asks you to step outside your comfort zone, not in a dramatic crisis, but in small, manageable ways that still require real effort. Maybe it is rising before the dawn when the air is cold and the mind resists sleep. Perhaps it is enduring an hour of silence in a bustling, noisy world when every part of you craves distraction or noise. Or maybe it is taking a bath that is colder than your usual skin has known. The goal here is not momentary suffering for its own sake. It is intellectual discipline applied to the physical and emotional self. It is learning the virtue of acceptance through deliberate discomfort. The first, natural reaction when faced with cold or hardship is resistance. A flinching, a complaint, an immediate desire to revert to what was easy. But the Stoic practitioner intercepts that impulse. They do not fight the sensation, they simply observe it. They label it. This is cold. This is hard. This is uncomfortable. The power of the feeling does not come from the coldness itself, but from the internal struggle against it. We treat discomfort not as a signal to retreat, but as an opportunity for mental training, an anchor point for focus. The discomfort becomes a testing ground for our deepest convictions. If we believe that virtue is attainable, then we must prove that virtue can withstand physical indignity and emotional impatience. We seek the gentle friction against the smooth habit of ease. Imagine a life spent always in perfect comfort, soft pillows, temperate weather, endless abundance. Such a life creates brittle minds. A slight shift, a sudden illness, a minor deprivation, can shatter the illusion of invincibility. The soul becomes accustomed to being buffered from reality, and thus it loses its necessary edge. The deliberate embrace of discomfort acts as a mental inoculation. By choosing voluntarily to feel slightly uncomfortable today, we prepare our inner self for genuine hardship when it arrives uninvited. We are training the spirit to find equilibrium not in perfect conditions, but in variable ones. This discipline teaches radical acceptance. It whispers, life is not always kind. Therefore, your ability to remain steady must be cultivated regardless of external conditions. The initial discomfort, the shivering skin, the taut muscles, the impatience rising at a slow pace, is merely data. Data that tells us where our psychological boundaries lie and how far we can stretch them without breaking. The lesson is profound. True power lies not in avoiding struggle, but in mastering the internal state while experiencing it. It is the quiet realization that pain itself has no inherent moral weight. The hardship simply exists, neutrally, and your task is to remain rational and composed within its presence. You are learning to find peace with what must be endured. This journey towards acceptance transforms us from passive victims of circumstance into active stewards of our own emotional landscape. We acknowledge that some things simply will not change. The season will turn regardless of our wish. The person we love may depart despite our deepest hopes, and times of restriction are an inescapable part of the human story. To accept is not to be passive or resigned in a fatalistic sense. It is active recognition. It is looking into the face of reality, the cold water, the early hour, the unavoidable difficulty, and saying, "I see you. You are here. And because you are here and I am still breathing, my capacity for reason remains intact." This cultivated tolerance becomes a guiding principle. Whenever faced with a challenge that feels disproportionately large, or an irritation that seems unbearable, we recall the simple act of embracing discomfort. We remind ourselves that this too shall pass, that even the most acute pain is temporary and survivable through sustained mental effort. The voluntary ordeal proves that our internal resilience, the core citadel, is far stronger than any transient external pressure could ever suggest. We have traveled far from the frantic pace of reaction. We began immersed in the storm's edge, swept away by external chaos and our own desperate attempts to control outcomes that simply do not yield to our will. In the inner roar, we found the exhausting cycle of panic, fueled by resistance, a constant battle against what is already happening. Through moments of profound stillness, where exhaustion forced a critical pause, we slowly began to suspect that the true source of suffering resided not beyond us, but deep within the judgment of our own minds. The journey deepened as we questioned control itself, learning the essential wisdom. There are things entirely outside the sphere of human influence. This knowledge brought a radical clarity through the dichotomy, the stark realization that while the world around us is vast and indifferent, the only true province of our being lies in our internal capacity to choose how we respond. We trained ourselves to shrink our focus from the wide scope of concern down to the potent precision of mere action. By reframing our crises, we learned a profound cognitive discipline, that any difficult event is not necessarily an attack or a tragedy, but rather data. It is information presented for mental training. This shift in perspective allowed us to view pain and setbacks as nothing more than neutral stimuli, mandatory exercises designed by life itself to hone the virtue of acceptance. And so we reach the core principle. The antidote to judgment is recognizing that events themselves possess no inherent moral valence. A traffic jam, a scathing remark from an acquaintance, even the cold drizzle on a perfect day, these are merely physical occurrences. They are facts devoid of emotional charge. It is our judgment applied to these facts that generates suffering. The true challenge lies in separating the neutral event from the reactive story we immediately weave around it. The difficulty is not living through a setback, but resisting the ingrained human habit of assigning meaning, particularly negative meaning, to every single passing moment. Our minds are built for drama, to find conflict and injustice everywhere, even where none exists. The work here requires constant vigilance and an intellectual honesty that can be deeply unsettling. We must learn to intercept the judgment before it has a chance to take root and dictate our emotional state. When faced with irritation, we do not ask ourselves what is wrong with the world. Instead, we ask a precise series of questions. What is the undeniable fact here? And how am I choosing to interpret that fact? Consider the unpredictable delays in daily life, the slow line at the post office, the unexpected detour. The immediate, untrained response is often frustration, an angry judgment proclaiming that this inconvenience is unjust or intolerable. But the trained mind recognizes this as a moment of intellectual neutrality. It sees not a terrible waste of time, but simply a duration of waiting. The power resides in acknowledging that these indifferent events do not inherently hurt us. The discomfort is constructed internally, through our resistance to what merely is. Suffering, therefore, becomes less a function of circumstance and more a direct consequence of misplaced mental judgment. This realization grants an immense freedom, but it also demands rigorous practice. We must treat the mind like a muscle that needs disciplined repetition. When anger flares at another person's perceived mistake, we pause, remembering that their action is largely beyond our control. It originated in their own set of indifferent impulses. Our sphere of influence remains solely within our judgment and response. The philosophy becomes a radical act of non-attachment to emotional narrative. It teaches us to greet the world with an observer's detached curiosity rather than a participant's outraged passion. We are learning to view life not as a series of personal affronts, but as continuous streams of neutral data points, data upon which we exercise our supreme power, the judgment itself. To master this is to achieve a profound state of cognitive detachment. It means acknowledging that while pain may be inevitable, despair over that pain is optional. We learn that the external world will continue its relentless passage regardless of our comfort or disappointment. It is the enduring flow, the ceaseless rhythm of existence, that we must synchronize with. The path forward is to practice this neutrality in every small moment, accepting the taste of bland food, tolerating an uncomfortable conversation, navigating the predictable frustration of routine bureaucratic inefficiency. Each instance becomes a chance to reaffirm that our peace does not depend on perfect outcomes, or even favorable ones at that, but only upon the integrity of our internal judgment process. We are moving beyond merely surviving difficulty. We are learning how to view reality with the profound calmness of an ancient philosopher who understood that the biggest storms are often those raging within the human heart, fueled by unexamined interpretation. The key to serenity is thus not avoidance, but perfect, radical clarity. Separating the immutable facts from the ephemeral stories we tell ourselves about them. For years, you have wrestled with the tidal wave of life. You learn to identify the external forces that do not belong within your domain, realizing the crucial boundary between what is truly yours and what remains beyond your reach. The panic has lessened. The frantic need to control outcomes has begun to soften into a steady recognition of reality's impartial nature. But true mastery demands more than just identifying the problem. It requires inhabiting the golden space, that small, miraculous gap that exists between the moment you are struck by an event and the instant when you choose your response. We often assume that our actions are instantaneous, automatic ripples based on a single stimulus. We feel like reactive machines, jolted into action by anything that crosses our path. But philosophy reveals a subtle but profound truth. There is space, a breath, a sliver of silence. This interval is the sacred ground of human freedom, and it is within this void that all genuine choice resides. Think of any moment of high tension. An argument erupts in public view. Words are hurled like stones. Someone else's careless comment cuts deep. The natural reflex is immediate, visceral retaliation to fire back the quickest, sharpest words possible. This immediate reaction is not you. It is your conditioning. Your panic speaking before reason has had a chance to arrive. It burns bridges and exhausts the spirit. The goal of Stoicism here is to become an architect of that pause, to treat every stimulus not as a command for action, but as mere data, a piece of information requiring thoughtful consideration. The immediate reaction seeks catharsis. It aims to eliminate the pain by matching its intensity. But the measured response seeks clarity. It aims to understand the structure of the exchange itself. Consider that moment when you feel your blood rising with anger. Before any word leaves your mouth, there is a chemical torrent, adrenaline mixing with frustrated thought. This physical surge is what pushes you toward reaction. To intercede here requires calling upon more than just knowledge. It demands profound mental discipline, the ability to observe the bodily impulse without yielding to it. The initial training was recognizing the event as neutral. Now, we must train ourselves to recognize the urge, the desire for immediate vindication, for the sweet satisfaction of making the other person regret their words. This urge is often more powerful than the external event itself, because it taps into our deepest need to be understood and validated. The crucial practice is therefore developing metacognition, the awareness of your own thinking process. When conflict arises, observe that internal escalation before you speak. Notice the tightening in the chest, the clenching of the jaw, the spiraling narrative of "they always do this." These bodily signals are not warnings of danger. They are simply notifications of a powerful emotional wave cresting and collapsing. You must learn to separate yourself from your own neurochemistry. Your anger is not reality. The thought that you have been wronged is merely an interpretation, colored by past hurts, and it requires a second pass of scrutiny. Was this comment truly malicious, or was it the sloppy byproduct of another person's bad day? Did they genuinely intend to wound, or were they simply operating from ignorance, much like children who do not yet understand consequence? The pause is therefore an act of profound empathy mixed with intense self-mastery. When you are tempted to react, instead imagine that moment of silence. That breath you take is a gift of space granted by your own inner resolve. This space allows reason to rise up and gently guide the more volatile parts of yourself. The responsive mind asks 3 questions in that pocket of stillness. First, is this thought useful? Does it lead me toward virtue or merely deepen my bitterness? Second, am I responding based on fact, or am I operating from an emotional forecast, a prediction of future hurt? And third, what is the most rational and dignified action right now, even if it does not satisfy my immediate need for justice? This space between stimulus and response is where the philosopher lives. It is where we trade automatic survival mechanisms for deliberate moral choice. It is a quiet, subtle form of resistance against the tyranny of instinct. To master this pause is to prove that your inner self is stronger than any external pressure. It means realizing that while you cannot control what happens to you in traffic, or what another person will say during an argument, you maintain absolute sovereignty over how you process and transmit meaning from those events. It is the ultimate act of internal power, to withhold the predictable explosion, to allow yourself to simply be with the difficulty, trusting that by remaining calm and rational in the storm, your inner citadel will solidify further, making the next challenge met not with strained endurance, but with quiet, unshakable peace. We have walked through the fires of reaction. We learned that our initial response to pain is often rooted not in the event itself, but in a fierce internal judgment about what that event means for us. From distinguishing between the things we can control and those that simply flow around us, we have begun the arduous work of accepting impermanence and acknowledging our inner authority. The crisis no longer feels like an overwhelming external force. It has become a proving ground for the spirit. But understanding is not enough. Knowledge remains inert until it is embodied. It must be built into the very architecture of the self. And this, we realize, is the task of building what the ancients called the inner citadel. Imagine now that your mind is a vast piece of ground. Over time, under the stress of life, doubt and anxiety have constructed walls of panic, walls that crumble at the first strong wind of adversity. To achieve true resilience, we must build something stronger, a fortress within, impenetrable not by brute force, but by reasoned thought. The inner citadel is not some magical place. It is a disciplined state of being. It is the self-possession achieved when reason becomes your primary inhabitant and virtue becomes the cornerstone. Think of it as the final layer of defense against the emotional assaults of judgment, the need to own outcomes, the terror of change, or the blinding sting of unfairness. This mental fortress must be designed brick by careful brick. Each lesson learned about acceptance, each painful event viewed as neutral data, is a load-bearing wall added to the structure. Every moment we choose thoughtful reflection over immediate outcry solidifies its foundations. It teaches us that peace is not the absence of struggle, but the stability achieved within the center while the world outside roars. The builders of this inner life must become intimately familiar with their own psychological terrain. They must be vigilant architects, constantly surveying for weaknesses. Where does the panic try to breach? When fear whispers about potential failure or loss, we do not argue with it. Rather, we observe it. We acknowledge its presence, labeling it simply as a thought, recognizing that a mere thought is fundamentally unthreatening. The walls of this citadel are constructed by mastering observation. We train ourselves to pause in the space between stimulus and response, becoming conscious witnesses to our own emotional impulses. This practice of metacognition is vital. It means understanding that you are not your anger, nor are you your fear. You are the rational self observing those transient states. The citadel stands because it operates on a singular principle, recognizing that its primary threat cannot penetrate reasoned indifference. External events, the loss of status, the harsh words of others, the unexpected setback, these are merely weather. They pass. The mind built upon reason and virtue remains unbowed by them. Resilience is not innate. It is forged in difficulty. It is the habit developed through repeated small acts of principled response. When a challenge arrives, the citadel does not panic. Instead, its core mechanisms activate. First, assessment. What is the fact here? Second, identification. What portion of this falls outside my jurisdiction? Third, and most critically, choice. How shall I respond with wisdom? This architecture requires continuous maintenance. There will be days when the siege engines of worry are strong, days when the seductive comforts of emotional reaction promise an easier path than thoughtful discipline. On those days, we must remember the purpose of the citadel. It is not built for glory or comfort, but for unbreakable character. The goal is simple yet monumental: to construct a self so internally secure that external chaos has diminished power over your inner landscape. When the storms rage outside, you become their quiet point of reference. You remain sovereign within the boundaries of your judgment and your actions. This is ultimate freedom. It is the knowledge that no matter what happens in this life, nothing can truly dismantle who you are at your core, the reasoned self, dedicated to virtuous living. The true resilience of the inner citadel is revealed not when everything is peaceful, but when life presents its most discordant symphony. It is found in the stillness that remains after the noise has peaked, confirming that the foundations laid through practice were deep and unshakable. We have spent so long believing that peace is a destination we arrive at only after overcoming the last great struggle. We believed that mastery meant surviving the storm, building an impenetrable wall around our inner self. But true strength, like wisdom itself, does not merely shield us. It radiates outward. Remember the journey to build the inner citadel. We learned how to observe the chaos without being consumed by it. We found the profound space between the stimulus and the response. Our mind became a place of quiet watchfulness. The external world remained noisy, harsh, and deeply unpredictable, but now we had mastered our internal landscape. This realization was not meant only for survival. It was meant to be shared, because self-mastery does not exist in isolation. It is the foundation upon which meaningful human connection is built. When we finally understand what truly belongs only to us, our judgment, our intention, our capacity for choice, that quiet power cannot be contained within a fortress' walls. It must flow out. Life does not wait for us to achieve perfect understanding. The greatest challenges are rarely single, monumental events. They gather in the mundane moments, the accumulation of small pressures that test the soul slowly and steadily. We have journeyed from the height of crisis, through the raging storms of panic, and established the solid foundation of self-mastery within our inner citadel. We learn to distinguish between the vast ocean of external concerns and the manageable pool of internal judgment. We found the space between impulse and action. Yet, life does not simplify itself merely because we have read about it. It continues its relentless rhythm, demanding choice in every passing moment. The true test of philosophy is not passed during a dramatic confrontation with fate. It is lived out on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The practice, therefore, must become the habit of the heart and mind, a continuous, gentle vigilance. This means finding the small victories that build a big life. It is in these miniature moments that our discipline is truly forged. Consider the smallest interactions. The crowded sidewalk where two people collide unexpectedly, a delay on the subway train, the endless wait for bureaucracy to process a simple form. These are not grand trials worthy of epic philosophical debate, but they are daily crucibles. They test whether we have truly internalized the quiet power of our own reasoned response. The emotional pull in these small moments is always towards irritation, to frustration, to complaint. We instinctively catalog the offense. Look at this careless driver. This system is utterly broken. Why must my routine be disrupted? These immediate reactions are whispers of the old self, still addicted to the drama and control that we have learned to gently disarm. They pull us back into the familiar exhaustion of resistance. But now, something different happens. There is a momentary pause, a slight physical hitch in the breath, a subtle mental detachment. The ingrained response is overridden by the memory of our training. We recall the fundamental principle. This event itself holds no moral weight, only our interpretation does. The driver who cuts us off does not commit an injustice against our spirit. They simply act with haste and poor consideration. It is the thought that screams unfairness, that elevates a mere action to a personal attack, that causes the internal distress. This realization, this gentle separation of fact from narrative, is a small victory. It might only last for 3 seconds, the time it takes to feel anger rising, and then deliberately choosing to observe the heat without feeding it with judgment. This act of observation is where freedom resides. We train our minds to see these irritations as data points, neutral evidence about the world's current state, devoid of inherent personal meaning or moral value. A traffic jam does not inherently frustrate us. Rather, our expectation that movement should be constant, perfect, and instant is thwarted, leading to the frustration. The art becomes one of radical acceptance applied to minutiae, accepting the delay not as a punishment, but as an inevitable component of existence. Reframing the wasted time not as loss, but as an unscheduled opportunity for reflection, to read a passage of wisdom that we would have ignored in our frantic rush. This consistent collection of small choices is what accumulates into a profound change of character. It is not one grand moment of philosophical revelation that redeems us. It is the 1,000 tiny acts of grace exercised when no one is watching, and no dramatic stakes are attached. The journey teaches us to become masterful curators of our inner lives. We must practice viewing every minor inconvenience, the slow line at the bank, the cold morning air, the unexpected rain, as a compulsory drill in equanimity. These daily skirmishes build the muscle memory of calmness. By choosing response over reaction, moment after mundane moment, we do more than just weather temporary discomfort. We are systematically dismantling our psychological habit of demanding constant perfection from an imperfect world. The small victory is simply realizing that your inner peace does not depend on external flawless service or convenient timing. It depends solely on the integrity and discipline of your internal ascent. That choice, repeated day after day, is how we build a big life. A life anchored in virtue, unshakable by circumstance, because it has learned to find its stability in the smallest, most unassuming moments. After traversing the treacherous landscapes of internal struggle, after learning to distinguish the small sphere of our own control from the vast chaos of external concern, we arrive at a profound quiet. This final frontier of Stoic wisdom asks us not for mastery over fortune, but for contentment with what is. The earlier lessons taught us that peace is found in recognizing where our power truly lies, within the boundaries of our judgment and our intentions. We learn to view crises as mere neutral data points, training ourselves to respond rationally instead of reacting emotionally. But even when we grasp this monumental shift, when we accept that anger is merely a voluntary interpretation of an event, a subtle restlessness can remain. The mind, trained for struggle, sometimes forgets the quiet joy of simply being. This chapter speaks of the philosophy of enough, the art of contentment. It challenges the relentless modern narrative of lack, the constant feeling that we need more achievement, more wealth, more connection, or more experience to finally feel whole. Our instinct is always toward acquisition, a belief system rooted in perpetual wanting. The deepest human struggle, it seems, is not overcoming external hardship, but quietening internal dissatisfaction. We build our identities upon future promises, the next promotion, the perfect relationship, the ideal life stage, and we sacrifice the present moment on the altar of what if. We become perpetually dissatisfied travelers, always gazing toward a horizon that, by its nature, recedes as we approach it. The path illuminated by Stoicism gently redirects this gaze. It instructs us to pause and look around, truly seeing the abundance already present, the quiet strength in our own mind, the simple, reliable rhythm of breath, the supportive texture of familiar life. Contentment is not a passive resignation. It is an active form of appreciation, a focused choice to value what already sustains us. The ancient philosophers recognized this trap. They understood that by fixating on absence, what we lack, what might fail, what should be better, we inadvertently deplete the reserves of joy and gratitude in our present experience. The mind mistakes scarcity for survival, creating a cycle where perceived need generates anxiety, and anxiety prevents true appreciation. To cultivate this wisdom, we must practice radical detachment from desire itself. We are taught to examine the nature of wanting. What is it that makes us feel incomplete? Is it truly the object, or is it the belief that ownership will fill an intrinsic void? Often, we find that when the craving is identified and then gently observed, without judgment or resistance, its power begins to dissipate. The journey back to enough requires humility. It demands that we surrender the powerful, deeply ingrained cultural myth that happiness must be hard-won through monumental sacrifice or ceaseless striving. Instead, contentment asks for a simple agreement with reality. This breath is enough. This moment of light filtering through the trees is enough. The capacity of our own rational mind to choose virtue right now is more than enough. This realization does not mean settling for stagnation. Quite the opposite. True satisfaction gives us the energy to act, but it purifies the action. We begin to undertake goals and pursuits motivated not by desperate lack or fear of inadequacy, but by genuine internal desire, a desire that flows from a place of surplus rather than deficit. The philosophical practice deepens here, becoming an exercise in sustained gratitude. It is more sophisticated than merely saying thanks. It means actively noticing the systems of grace. Notice the reliability of food on your table. Notice the structure of law that keeps you safe. Notice the quiet persistence of life itself, even after a storm. When we anchor ourselves in this bedrock understanding, that what is already functioning well and what currently sustains our physical existence is inherently valuable, we build an unshakable foundation. Our ability to withstand the inevitable shifts and losses of life becomes profound because our core sense of worth is no longer tied to external metrics. The storms will return. They always do. We will face setbacks, failures, and unpredictable disruptions. But now, when those challenging forces batter the walls we have constructed, they find us anchored by a quiet certainty. We are resilient not because we have conquered every difficulty, but because we have mastered the subtle, difficult art of deep appreciation. The practice concludes with an integration, accepting life in its full, messy spectrum, the heights and the valleys, the success and the struggle. This is acceptance as a perpetual willingness to engage fully with reality, recognizing that the greatest luxury of all is simply having the consciousness to observe what passes, to understand what remains permanent, and to choose to value the quiet grace of enough. It is in this profound quiet that the true victory lies, not in the storm's absence, but in our perfect state of inner harbor. We have walked through the initial shocks of crisis. We learned to identify what we could not control, and we began the painful work of distinguishing between external facts and our internal judgments about those facts. The path toward calm is rarely found in a single moment of perfect peace. Rather, it emerges from the tireless accumulation of small, reflective choices. It is this continuous choice that defines the practice. Finding stillness within the storm is not a destination we arrive at and rest in. It is an always present act of conscious discipline. We must understand that virtue itself is not a shield against misfortune, but rather the steel required to face misfortune without shattering. The storms of life will continue, of course. They are built into the fabric of existence, serving as the necessary resistance against which our inner strength must be continually tested. Therefore, we must approach every new day with the mindset of an ongoing apprenticeship. This journey is less about avoiding struggle and more about perfecting the art of enduring it well. Our practice demands that we carry the philosophy with us, not just in times of acute pain, but into the dull predictability of our ordinary lives. We are called to find the philosopher within the everyday routine. It will be in the slow queue at the bakery, in the unexpected delay on a train track, in the sharp words exchanged with a loved one when exhaustion sets in. These small moments, these tiny disruptions, become the continuous crucibles for the soul. Each irritation is an opportunity for practice. When reality frustrates our expectation, when the outcome we desire fails to materialize, it presents itself not as a failure of fate, but as a chance to reset our inner dialogue. To pause and ask ourselves, is my current distress rooted in the event itself, or in my expectation that the event should have been otherwise? This questioning is the engine of growth. We must cultivate an unshakable habit of self-interrogation. When discomfort arises, when we feel frustrated, ignored, or slighted, we are trained to observe these initial emotional flares from a respectful distance. We do not judge the anger. We merely observe it as a physiological reaction, like noting the rising temperature of a fever. By reducing our immediate identification with the emotion, we create that precious space between the stimulus and our response. This internal pause is where our sovereignty lies. It is the quiet moment when the self chooses wisdom over impulse. Furthermore, this constant practice requires us to become vigilant protectors of our minds. We must treat our attention like a finite resource, guarding it fiercely from unnecessary worry or complaint. The temptation will always be to look outward, to blame the system, the weather, or the person standing before us, because blaming others offers a temporary, comforting illusion of control. But true self-mastery demands that we pull our gaze back. We must focus solely on the quality of our own assent, the integrity of our internal decision to accept what is and to choose how we will respond. This discipline deepens into a profound form of gratitude, not just for grand moments of fortune, but for the simple, unadorned fact of being present right now. Gratitude becomes the antidote to complaint, anchoring us to the reality that has already been given. When we realize that our contentment does not depend on accumulating more achievements or experiencing perfect external conditions, but only on the stable discipline of our own mind, we find a radical freedom. We build an inner structure, an invisible citadel of reason and virtue. This citadel cannot be breached by market crashes, relationship betrayals, or sudden illness. It is founded upon the understanding that the law of nature is simple. Things change, they are temporary, and resistance to this truth guarantees pain. Our continuous practice acknowledges this fundamental flux. We accept the passing of good fortune with grace, knowing it too must pass, just as we acknowledge the sting of setback without allowing it to define our self-worth. The goal, ultimately, is not emotional immunity, for life contains genuine grief and difficulty, but rather intellectual resilience. It is the quiet, unshakable knowledge that even when the body falters or external fortune withdraws completely, the rational faculty remains operational. This unwavering commitment to reason in all circumstances transforms mere survival into a profound state of being fully alive and deeply free. The storm will always gather on the horizon line of our existence, but we are no longer simply caught within its chaotic sweep. We have learned how to stand at the edge of it, drawing strength not from defiance, but from profound, practiced acceptance. This steady self-possession is the ultimate wisdom. The